give you a little bit more of a commercial, if you will. This is one of our events for the centennial of women's suffrage. We were lucky enough to partner with the League of Women Voters for the 2020 celebration. We obviously had a very big group of events planned. COVID put paid to the vast majority of them, of course. We do still have an exhibition up in our museum. We are still selling the window signs for a woman who's registered to vote in this house. They are still available if you like. It's past the election, but they're print on demand, so we can make them for you. We were part of the Zoom lecture that the League of Women Voters did, and that was where we actually got in touch with Dr. Poulson. She was one of the keynote speakers, and she was nice enough to come and talk with us today as well. If any of your friends or anybody you know missed today, wasn't able to make it, we are recording this. It's going to be on our YouTube channel, probably Monday or Tuesday, so they'll be able to see it next week. And that way, you can let them know what they missed. Likewise, next week we are going to do an online auction for the Society for a fundraiser through Actria. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I hope I am. The link is on our Facebook page, on our website, on our Twitter. So you can go and get some early Christmas presents set up. You can get something for yourself. All the money goes to preserve local history. And then likewise, the first weekend in December, we're going to be doing our Swetland Christmas tours on the first Saturday and first Sunday. And this year we're going to do Christmas during an epidemic, which is pretty fitting. So we're going to do 1891, when there was a major typhoid epidemic in the area. We're going to do 1902, the winter of 1901, 1902, when there was a major smallpox epidemic in the area, and basically show that the holidays go on in a modified form, and as long as you're safe, you can still celebrate. So even though everything's new and scary to us, it has been done before, and we have come through it on the other end successfully. So hopefully it'll be hopeful for people. Now, without further ado, you didn't come here to listen to me blather, as my wife likes to tell me. So I will introduce our speaker today. Dr. Susan Poulson has received her PhD in United States history from Georgetown University. She's, of course, currently a speaker or a professor of U.S. history at the University of Scranton, where she teaches 20th century and history of the American women, which is why she was with us through the League of Women Voters. She is published in the area of history of higher education and women's history, and is presently writing a study on crime after the Civil War, which I can't wait to get my hands on a copy of that. As soon as that's published, let me know, Dr. Poulson. I want a copy of that. During her lecture, she's going to speak from her most recently published monograph, Suffrage, The Epic Struggle for Women's Rights to Vote, which was published by Prager in 2019. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I give you Dr. Susan Poulson.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Mary, for that kind introduction. Let me pull up my PowerPoint here, and how does that look? Can people see that all right? Okay, very good, thank you. I'm delighted to be here. How nice it is to see fellow historians, people interested in history on a Friday night. As many of you know, this is the centennial year for the year that women achieved the right to vote in 1920 after quite a long struggle. And I'd like to spend a few minutes tonight giving you a brief overview of that struggle. So let's start with a few basic questions. What is the women's suffrage movement? Well, it's actually one of the longest struggles for civil rights in US history. It was a 72-year struggle. Historians generally count back to 1848 and the Seneca Falls Convention in upstate New York. And this is where women and some men gathered for 2 days in Seneca Falls, and at the end signed a document that called for the right to vote. 72 years later, the 19th Amendment is ratified just barely and just in time for the 1920 elections, and that's the 19th Amendment. So it's a 72-year struggle. Now, its origins, much of its impetus comes out of the abolition movement, the attempt to get rid of slavery prior to the Civil War. And one of its activists was named Lucretia Mott, a Philadelphia Quaker woman, a mother of 6, who was involved in many reform movements, prison reform, temperance, Native American efforts. And one of them was abolition. She and her husband were very strong abolitionists. And she was selected by a Philadelphia Abolitionist Society to attend a world convention to try to prevent slavery, to try to eliminate slavery from the world. One of the other early founders of this movement is a woman who dedicates nearly her entire life to this effort. Her name is Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And so they first meet actually in London in 1840, in the summer of 1840. Now the British had passed legislation to get rid of slavery in their empire in the early 1830s, and that was something they were proud of. And they wanted to spearhead an effort to get rid of slavery around the world. It still existed, as you know, in the French Empire, in the United States, and Brazil, and in a certain form in Russia. So they invited delegates from around the world to come to this convention for nearly 2 weeks and meet in the grand Freemasons Hall in the heart of London and decide to make worldwide strategy on how to overcome this grave moral evil. Well, the largest delegation to show up were 40 Americans, including a handful of women. They had been elected, such as Lucretia Mott. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton's husband had also been elected. His name is Henry Stanton, and they were actually just recently married, and they were on their honeymoon. So they opened the convention, but the very first day, after some of the ceremony, the convention dropped into a rancorous debate over whether or not to seat the women. And it went on for quite a while. And they took a vote at the very end, and the men present, now these were some of the most progressive men in Western civilization, they voted overwhelmingly not to seat the women. And they permitted the women to sit along the side in silence and observe. And if you look at this official portrait of this convention, you'll see men, but look along the side, you'll see the women when there's one on the left and there's several on the right. So Lucretia Mott had traveled all the way to participate and was silenced. And she sat off to the side, and that's when she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And they were so outraged at this silencing that they decided that women needed to demand their rights. And they vowed that when they got back to the US, they would hold a convention. Now, the most prominent white abolitionist of this era is William Lloyd Garrison. He too attended the convention, but he arrived a few days late. And he was so shocked at the silencing of the women that he refused to participate. And he sat in solidarity next to Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton for the entire duration. Well, it took 8 years, but Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton did finally call for a women's rights convention in the hometown of Elizabeth Cady Stanton at that time, who had gone on to bear several children. And so it took place in July 19th and 20th of 1848 in a small Methodist church in the heart of town. And women and then men joined in, debated what should women demand? What should their rights look like? And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, on her own, added a demand for the right to vote, which even Lucretia Mott thought was asking for too much. It was such a controversial assertion. But at the end of the 2 days, 68 women signed a document called the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled on the Declaration of Independence, which called for rights. And 32 men signed a document of support. The next question is, why did it take so long? Why 72 years? In fact, Clara Barton, who first became famous during the Civil War as a nurse in the battlefield, nicknamed the Angel of the Battlefield, and then went on to found the Red Cross. She was a fervent supporter of women's suffrage. She died 8 years before the 19th Amendment, but she said she thought it would, she knew it would come sooner or later. And she said, when it does, all will wonder, as we have done, what the question ever was. So I think the legitimacy of women voting now is so common sense that we have to wonder, why did it take 3.5 generations to bring this about? And to provide that explanation, we have to return to the mid-1800s and review the common conception of women. It was like a seamless perception that women were inherently inferior and subordinate. And it was embedded in many parts of American society. Our laws followed the English common law tradition, which had been codified over 100 years before by Sir William Blackstone in a book called Commentaries on the Laws of England. And he stated that women would be divided legally into 2 categories. And the first one is called femme sole. And that's a woman who is unmarried. And she had many rights. She could sign a contract. She could earn her wages and control them. If she inherited money, she could take control of that. But once she married, her legal status changed and she became technically a femme covert. And this system is called coverture. And her legal identity was then melded into that of her husband's. And so she could no longer sign a contract. She couldn't control her wages. If she inherited anything, the money became her husband's. He had a right of access to her body for sexuality. If they divorced, which was very rare, he would automatically retain control of the children, and so on. So you can imagine that this was embedded in the law, and it is a legal subordination of women. And it was seen as normal because it had been around for so long. Here it is, by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being or legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, etc. Now, theology also endorsed the idea that women were subordinate, as it was then interpreted at the time. Of course, religions evolve. The story of creation was often interpreted as Eve being of a weaker moral character, and St. Paul had said, let the women be silent in the church, which at the time many took as a literal rule. And then you add to that science. Now, science, of course, had been around for hundreds of years, but it was gaining in prestige in the 1800s. The most prestigious scientist of the era is Charles Darwin. We all know who he is. He published On the Origin of the Species in 1859, in which he introduced the concept of natural selection, in which species evolve by competition. He said, by sexual selection, which depends not on a struggle for existence, but on a struggle between the males for possessions of the females. A dozen years later, he published his second book, pictured here, called The Descent of Man. And in this book, he applied his Darwinian theory, his evolutionary theory, to humans and made certain observations. Among them, he said, man, this is a quote, has ultimately become superior to woman. He said that because of the evolutionary struggle for control of females, he said that men had become more energetic, courageous, and inventive, shaped by the necessity to capture food, make weapons, and fend off enemies. He said that women and men had in earlier times been equal, but that women had become inferior over time because of the necessity of bearing and raising children. He said it made them morally superior and less selfish, but it also made them, quote, intellectually inferior. He said the women's skull was sized between the child and the man, and that they, while they are more perceptive, intuitive, and possibly imitative, they are also, these are qualities characteristic of the lower races, and therefore of a past and lower state of civilization. He did believe that women could resume their equality with men, but this would mean that they would pay less attention to children and to families. And he said, for the sake of happiness of our homes, he said it was important that women be kept basically in this subordinate position and be educated for that. And there were other scientists. The first head of the American Medical Association, Dr. Albert Still, said that he believed women were irrational, capricious, and indecisive, quote, which totally unfits her for professional pursuits. This is G. Stanley Hall. He's the first president of the American Psychological Association, the most prestigious psychologist of the era. He's the one who hosted Sigmund Freud's soul visit to the United States. And he was the leading expert on adolescent psychology. And he thought that women actually could endure the rigors of higher education, but that they should be educated differently, basically, that women would be more generalists and male brains were more built for specialization. Now, Dr. E.H. Clarke, he was a Harvard Medical School professor, a leading expert on physiology, and he warned that strenuous study that women undertook in higher education would damage their the development of the reproductive organs. In fact, he claimed to have treated such cases. He said one young woman developed no breasts, another stopped menstruating because she studied too hard, and his most serious patient, he called Miss G, studied so hard that she, quote, was unable to make a good brain that could stand the wear and tear of life and a good reproductive system that should serve the race. He said he advised her to stop studying, but she would not yield. She continued to study for long hours to prepare for tests and examinations, and she died as a result. So he published his findings in a book called Sex in Education, coming out in the 1870s. So here was a wall of prestigious scientists who were telling society that based on scientific evidence that women were biologically inferior. And one Cornell student at the time, M. Carey Thomas, who would go on to be the first woman president of Bryn Mawr, who said as a student she wondered whether it could really be true, as everyone thought that boys were cleverer than girls. I never dared to ask any grown-up person the direct question, not even my father or mother, because I feared to hear the reply. Now, in addition to science, there's organized opposition and ridicule to anyone who would suggest the idea. Here's the headquarters for the National Association opposed to women's suffrage, but also ridicule, you know, always a very powerful tool. Here's a depiction of what a liberated woman would look like. She's sitting around while the man does the housework. And here, also on election day, the woman who looks very manly is heading out to vote while the poor husband has to take care of the children. So basic propriety made it very difficult for women to even go out and venture forth and ask for the right to vote. It was improper for women to speak in public in front of men. They could speak in a parlor in front of small groups of women. That was acceptable, but they were badly ostracized for daring to speak in front of conventions and other organizations. The other form of opposition, of course, is that there are racial questions that pop up over the decades during this effort to get women the right to vote. And we will continue to address this throughout this lecture. Now, there are internal divisions after the Civil War. Abolitionists and women's suffrage advocates and women's rights advocates more generally had been often unified in holding joint conventions and supporting each other. But there were terrible divisions at the end of the Civil War, stoked mostly by the 14th Amendment, which for the first time inserted the word male into the Constitution. And the women's suffragists divided over this. There were some, such as Lucy Stone, who felt that the plight of Black people in the United States after the Civil War was so grave that they needed to allow Black men to get the right to vote first, and that women will come later. And they believed, of course, shortly after. But there were others, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and now her partner, Susan B. Anthony, who disagreed and felt a deep sense of betrayal that people who had worked so hard for abolition now would not stand up for women. And this became so divisive that these two sets of leaders created separate organizations. Lucy Stone and others went on to create the American Women's Suffrage Association, and Stanton and Anthony went on to create the National Women's Suffrage Association. The latter being generally more radical in their tactics and their aims. But Frederick Douglass, who had actually been at the Seneca Falls Convention and promoted women's rights, he stood up at one of these conventions after the Civil War and made a statement as to why he thought that Black male rights, the right to vote, needed to come first. He said, if for Black men, it was a question of life and death. He said, when women because they are women, are hunted down through the cities of New York and New Orleans, when they are dragged from their houses and hung upon lampposts, when their children are torn from their arms and their brains dashed out upon the pavement, he said, then we will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. Then women, will have an urgency to obtain the ballot equal to our own. And Lucy Stone agreed with him, and many women agreed with him. And so this was called the Negroes' Hour, the time to promote Black male suffrage. Now, Stanton and Anthony were so angry that they started to issue racist articles. They created a newspaper called The Revolution, which reported racist stories, anti-immigrant stories, and basically expressing their outrage that people who were new American citizens or of a lesser stature in American society could vote and they could not. The next question is, what were some of the tactics used by this long movement? Well, in the beginning, it was generally individual speakers, such as Lucy Stone, just mentioned. She was a farm girl in rural Massachusetts who taught school at the age of 16 for a couple of years till she saved up enough money to attend the first coeducational college in U.S. history, Oberlin College in Northern Ohio. It's also the first college to admit Black Americans as well. And she, even before there, she was sort of a natural for women's rights. She caused trouble there. She got in trouble once because she took her hat off in the middle of church and was scolded for that. But she went on after college, after getting a degree, which was very rare back then, to be a full-time speaker for the abolitionist movement. Now, she did that for several years, but then in 1848, she saw a statue that so moved her that she decided she had to also speak for women's rights. And the statue is called The Greek Slave. And it was a depiction of a very demure, life-sized woman, naked, chained, and it was depicting she was a Greek who had been imprisoned by the Turkic Empire, the Ottoman Empire of that era. But for her, as she circled the statue in a museum near Boston Common in Boston, she almost burst into tears. She did later that night and said, I have to work for the women. Another woman, of course, is Susan B. Anthony, pictured here as a much older woman. She was a woman born in New York, a Quaker woman from a family that was involved in many progressive efforts. And she was a teacher. She was head teacher at Canajoharie School, very much liked. She headed the temperance movement in that city. She was considered the most admired woman of Canajoharie. She lived independently. She had male suitors, but she was deeply unhappy. she had been raised in a family that had very high and noble ideals, and she felt that she somehow was not living a meaningful enough life. So she quit her job, went home, and then gradually became involved in the women's rights movement, because her efforts in the temperance movement kept running into basically the attempts by male groups to subordinate women. So she transitioned from one group to another, and then of course became the most dedicated reformer of all these women, and she gets the nickname the Little Napoleon. Another individual speaker is Sojourner Truth. Now, Sojourner Truth was born Isabella Baumfree. That was her original name. She was born into slavery, still in New York, and was freed as a young adult, and then became a Pentecostal speaker, and that she took on the name Sojourner Truth, meaning she sojourned to tell the truth. And she traveled around the Northeast giving speeches, religious speeches, but then also abolitionist speeches and speeches for women's rights. Now, she was 6 feet tall, very strong woman, illiterate, but a very effective speaker, because she kind of said things plainly, and with the pointed out the terrible contradictions of traditionalists claiming they protected women when Black women were not protected at all. Another tactic used were the courts. Shortly after the Civil War, there were several women who tried to use the courts to get their rights. One of them is an Illinois woman named Myra Bradwell. She was very knowledgeable about the law. She helped her husband, who was a lawyer. She and her husband published the most important legal newspaper for the city of Chicago. And she passed the bar with high honors. And so she applied to the Illinois bar for admission, and they refused to let her in on the basis of her sex. And this went up to the Illinois Supreme Court, which also denied that. So it went on to the United States Supreme Court, which wrote a decision in 1871, 8-1, that said that women were unfit for the pursuit of law because, at least in one justice opinion, he wrote that women were too timid and delicate, and if they were to, there were certain careers that women should not pursue because they would harm the family. Now, Susan B. Anthony and her sister voted at their local polling place. They confronted 2 young men who were the poll watchers, the registrars, and they let them vote. And then they went home. And a few days later, a gentlemanly U.S. Marshal knocked at their door, and he told her that he was going to place her under arrest. And so she faced a trial. And this trial occurred in 1873. They had to move the venue of the trial because Susan B. Anthony was actually very popular in Rochester, where she lived at the time. And so they moved the trial to another area of New York. The judge was so prejudicial that he did not permit her to speak for herself, and he directed the jury to find her guilty, which they did. Although several later then told some other people that they weren't sure that they would have done that without the judge pressuring them. And in fact, President Trump just pardoned her this summer. Now, another famous case from this era was pursued by a woman named Frances Minor and her husband, and they lived in St. Louis, Missouri, and she too they both wanted her to have her rights to vote. So she challenged the registrar, and this went to the Missouri Supreme Court and then on to the U.S. Supreme Court, which in 1875 said that women are citizens, but citizenship does not necessarily bring voting rights. And so this attempt at the new departure, they called it, the attempt to get the court system to reinterpret the Constitution so that women already had rights, this failed. This was kind of the nail in the coffin for that particular tactic. Other tactics were federal testimony. The first woman to testify before Congress, pictured here, is Victoria Woodhull, pardon me, Victoria Woodhull, who would later go on to be involved in one of the biggest scandals of the era. But here she presented herself very well, very timidly at first, but presented her case very well. The committee listened very politely. Susan B. Anthony and several suffragists were in the audience, sort of shocked that she got the right to address this Judiciary Committee. And the Judiciary Committee buried what she said and never approved it or moved it out for a general vote. And this, of course, won't happen for another 40 years. The other efforts were state referendums. Dozens of states held referendums, and women suffragists from all across the nation would rush into that state and give speeches for months, hoping that a majority of men in a state or a territory would give women the right to vote. But for the first several decades, it failed. The first state to actually, where men gave women the right to vote by a majority, was the state of Colorado in 1893. Now here's a picture of a woman, a suffragist from Pennsylvania in 1915. They got a replica of the Liberty Bell. They put it on a flatbed truck and they drove it around the state of Pennsylvania for a referendum that was in the fall of 1915. The governor of Pennsylvania supported it. There were many loud supporters. People thought it would pass, and it failed. Now, another tactic was, and this one probably you could say backfired a bit, was Elizabeth Cady Stanton and some others challenged religion. Elizabeth Cady Stanton said that she believed that the greatest obstacle to women's advancement was traditional religion. And so she and 26 women put out the Women's Bible. It's a two-part book that tried to reinterpret biblical passages that addressed women. So it could be reinterpreted so that women, the Bible's not used as the sanction to subordinate them. But this was highly controversial. And the mainstream women's suffrage movement distanced itself from this because it was so offensive to so many ordinary Americans. There were symbolic protests, probably most famously the bloomer costume. Now, the traditional Victorian dress, you probably know, covered a woman from the bottom of her chin all the way down to only exposing basically her face and her hands. It was, she was corseted in the middle. The ideal waist was considered 18 inches. It made it hard for women to breathe. On top of that, your typical Victorian dress, full dress with all the layers of clothing, weighed around 20 pounds. So women were very hampered by this extensive dress. And one day, Elizabeth Cady Stanton's cousin, Elizabeth Smith Miller, showed up in Seneca Falls wearing an outfit similar to this. And this to us may not look very scandalous, but if we were living at the time, we would be deeply shocked because it shows that a woman has legs. It was even impolite to reference a woman's legs. You know, you never said woman, a leg when you talked about a woman, but here she was showing it. Plus, it was seeming to take on the prerogative of men for wearing pants. They tried to make it as delicate as they could. They did have little bows at the bottom, and you could see there's lace. And but this was deeply shocking. Some of the more radical women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, they wore this, but they found that it actually caused more trouble because people focused on it. Little boys chased them through the streets, kind of chanting things. And so, after a few years of insisting they would never stop wearing it, they quietly stopped wearing it and went back to traditional dress. Other protests at the centennial celebration of the Declaration of Independence in Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, Susan B. Anthony and a few other women obtained press passes to sit on the podium and disrupted this event by marching forward and interrupting the course of events and passing out pamphlets and then quietly leaving and then holding a protest meeting in downtown Philadelphia. And also during the dedication ceremony for the Statue of Liberty, where the New York harbor was filled with all kinds of boats in celebration, a group of suffragists rented a boat and hung suffrage banners, votes for women, and drove in and about the crowded New York harbor. Now, where did women first vote? Okay, because many women actually voted prior to the 19th Amendment being passed in 1920. And the answer is it was in the West. In fact, it was in Wyoming in 1869. Now, Wyoming was a territory at the time, so all they needed was the territorial legislature to give a simple majority, and women there could vote. And the all-male legislature voted to do that in 1869. And you might ask, why did they do that when it was such a struggle in other parts of the nation? Well, people in the West were used to strong women. They didn't fear strong women. In fact, most women knew how to ride a horse and shoot a gun and protect their homestead if they needed to. And so it wasn't a big leap to empower women with the vote. And not only did they give women the right to vote, they also let them hold public office. And here is Esther Morris, a 50-some-year-old Wyoming woman, mother of several hearty sons. She's about 6 feet tall, 180 pounds, and a plain-speaking woman. And the local South Path City, I think it was, they voted her in as the first woman justice of the peace in the world, and she served in that capacity. Wyoming also had the first women serve on juries. A few months later, Utah joined. Utah also was still a territory, but they joined for different reasons. They were populated mostly by Mormon immigrants after the Great Trek of 1847, where thousands of Mormons moved out to the Salt Lake City area. Their leader, Brigham Young, had been a practicing polygamist with more than 50 wives and nearly 100 children. And in the United States, there was very strong criticism of this new religion of Mormonism, the Church of Latter-day Saints of Jesus Christ. And one of the criticisms was polygamy, which its founder, Joseph Smith, had started during his lifetime, and many others had followed. So there were criticisms that this was an abuse of women, and Brigham Young and many of the leaders were eager to prove that not only were women participating voluntarily, but they had rights that women in the other parts of the United States did not. And so the women were also given the right to vote, this time in 1870. Now, the next question we could say is, when and why did the suffrage movement succeed? If we have so far described the obstacles to women's advancement and some of the tactics that seem to take so long, I think we go back to our original proposition is it comes out of the view of womanhood. And here we are in the late 1800s, 50 years after the Seneca Falls Convention and the first efforts. And there's a new type of womanhood that everybody observed. They called it the new woman. And it meant that women now were educated, they were organized, they were in professions that they had previously been denied. Women were doctors and lawyers and preachers. And they were now also involved in the political process. On the left, we have a Black women's temperance group from Buffalo, New York. And on the right, you have a similar group, all part of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was the largest mass movement of women in the 1800s, and it called for the right to vote. And here's the General Federation of Women's Clubs, one of their annual meetings. They had over 1 million members. And so we've gone from women being afraid to speak up in public and being very much tied to the home, and here they are traveling to cities, organizing, electing officers. So they're really entering the political arena. And in fact, the most admired woman in America is Jane Addams, who you probably have heard of. She headed Hull House in Chicago and will later win a Nobel Prize. And note that she is college educated and never married and never had children, but did great works through her charities and was deeply admired. So they're new role models for women as well. Another reason why it finally passes is the suffragists developed mass organizations, and they're sophisticated. Now, those two organizations I mentioned that split after the Civil War with Lucy Stone and the American Women's Suffrage Association, and then Stanton and Anthony on the other side with their organization, they joined in the late 1800s, and they created a giant organization called the National American Women's Suffrage Association. And this is the big granddaddy or grandmother of all the suffrage organizations, with many, many followers, led by very able leaders pictured here. Anna Howard Shaw, who was both a physician and a preacher, and then Carrie Chapman Catt, who saw the fight into the end. Also, a woman had actually been elected to Congress, and she was lauded. Jeanette Rankin was elected by Montana citizens to be a representative, and she took office in 1917, just in time for the vote on whether or not to for the United States to enter World War I. And it was quite a dramatic vote. She and others wept before they vote, but she voted against the United States joining. She joined 49 other representatives. Another reason why it finally succeeded is you've got a younger generation that's a whole lot more impatient. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton, late in her life, predicted this. She said, "We've been patient, and I can see that the younger generation is not going to be so patient." So Alice Paul and her cohort, Lucy Burns, both daughters of bankers, both young women who had gone to college, and they decided to go to England, and there they were influenced by the British suffragist organizations, which had was not quite very large, but it was very noticeable. They did dramatic things that were noticed around the world. They were headed by the Pankhurst, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her several of her daughters, and they adopted militancy. And they said that until we get the right to vote, we are now going to do things like break windows, interrupt political speeches. One woman threw herself in front of the king's racehorse at one of the most prominent races, where the king was there watching, and she actually was run over and died because of that. They started to set fires. And so Lucy Burns and Alice Paul met in prison, actually, in England after participating in this, and came back to the United States and decided to join the suffrage movement here, at first predicting that probably the US movement didn't need to be quite so militant. They didn't think it would take such a fight as it did in Britain, but they did end up following their own form of militancy. They organized a very large parade, which took place in 1913, the day before the new president, Woodrow Wilson, was to take his inaugural parade from the Capitol to the White House. In fact, Wilson showed up just after the parade had begun, and he had expected a group of followers and the public to meet him at Union Station and greet the new president. And he was shocked that it was empty. And he said, "Why?" And somebody said, "That's because everybody's watching the suffragist parade." Well, the parade started off very orderly, but it soon was descended into chaos. There were men basically lining the sidewalks, many of whom became vulgar, and some of them a bit violent. And they broke up the parades. Several women had to go to the emergency room. Finally, the police refused to do what was necessary to stop these attacks. And so the US Army called out soldiers from a nearby barracks, and they restored order. This got a lot of press, and it actually helped the suffrage cause, because these were women who were simply dressed in white, walking down the street asking for the right to vote. Now in 1917, Alice Paul and her party, called the National Women's Party, began to protest in front of the White House, pointing out the hypocrisy of the United States fighting a war to protect to make the world safe for democracy when there was not full democracy at home. Woodrow Wilson changed his mind somewhere around 1918. We're not exactly sure why. This is his wife and several daughters, and they were suffragists, and they tried to convince him. But he supported white supremacy, and he's on record saying he's worried about Black women getting the right to vote and it being able to undermine white supremacy. But probably the reason he supported it was there was a new political calculation. By the big breakthrough, it was in 1917, several states gave women the right to vote, including the most populous state in the nation, New York. And so by the elections of 1918, or coming up on the presidential elections of 1920, 2/3 of all states then had given women the right to participate in the Electoral College. And so it was a good idea to get on board because it seemed like an inevitability. So finally, Congress passes the 19th Amendment. The House passes it in May of 1919, and the Senate passes it in June of 1919. And that means it goes out for ratification. And it needs 36 states because it needs constitutionally 3/4 of the existing states. Several states here pictured yellow, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Illinois, they competed to be the first state to ratify. So it came in very quickly. Then the Western states came in, but the South was a source of opposition. Not entirely, Texas did pass it, but if you could see, the Deep South was very staunchly opposed. So it all came down to, at the end, the state of Tennessee, in which people knew would be a tight vote. More than 1,000 lobbyists from both sides showed up and lobbied hard and dramatically. And this is my favorite portion of the entire story. And the leader of the opposition brought it up for a vote, convinced he had enough votes, but one man changed his mind. It became a tie. And so he tried again, and he held another vote. And in the meantime, this man pictured here, Harry Byrne, a 25-year-old Republican, the youngest man in the House there from East Tennessee, had received a letter from his mother, Feb Byrne. She owned a farm in the eastern half. And she had been following the debate, and she hadn't said anything to her son, but she was offended by some of the things that the opponents had said. And so she wrote her son and said, help Carrie Chapman Catt put rat in ratification, be a good boy. And so she asked her son to support, and he tucked that letter in his pocket and went out, and he joined in that second vote. He changed his mind, and with that vote, women's suffrage passed in Tennessee. And that was the necessary vote. Now, the governor hesitated for a little bit, but then he signed it in the privacy of his office and sent it off, his certification of ratification, off to the Washington, D.C., and made a public announcement of doing so 1 hour after the train had left the station. And the Secretary of State, Bainbridge Colby, he was the man who was to certify that he received it, and when he signed it, it would become law. And so he left word at the State Department to wake him up when it arrived by train, and they did so. It was delivered to his home in the middle of the night, and he waited till a decent hour, and then on the morning of August 25th of 1920, he signed it into law. And at that moment, women did receive the right to vote, just in time for the 1920 election. And when they did vote, there was a 44% increase in the number of citizens voting. Now, not everyone, of course, this is a 72-year struggle then. Just to remind you, the Seneca Falls Convention had first called for the right to vote in 1848, and here they are voting in 1920. But let's keep in mind that not all women could vote. There were Black women who could vote in the North, but there was massive voter suppression in the South. There were some Black women who could vote in the South, but it would be another 40 years before that effort comes to fruition. Now, the League of Women Voters is birthed at this moment, that National American Women's Suffrage Association, the big grandmother organization. They vote themselves out of existence and transform themselves into the League of Women Voters, which, as we all know, is still a large and vibrant organization, now helping others to become informed about issues. And what I'd like to leave with is a quote from Olympia Brown, pictured here. And she had been a woman's suffrage fighter for 70 years. And she had gone on to be one of the first. She was the first ordained woman minister recognized by a denomination in the United States. She went to college. She was the first woman at a theological school in the US. She was accepted by several congregations where she preached in Vermont, Massachusetts, Connecticut, and ultimately in Racine, Wisconsin. And she had done all the tactics we went through. She had gone and participated in state referendums, giving more than 300 speeches in the state of Kansas alone. And she had joined Lucy Stone when they formed the American Women's Suffrage Association. She had testified before Congress first in 1876 and again 40 years later in 1814. She had protested and burned Wilson's speeches in front of the White House. And now, as an 85-year-old woman, she was going to vote for the first time. And she met with her congregation in Racine, Wisconsin, and she reminded them that she had resigned her pastorate 33 years before. She said it was a long time and many things have happened, but the grandest thing that has been the lifting up of the gates and the opening of the doors to the women of America, giving liberty to 27 million women, thus opening to them a new and larger life and a higher ideal. The future opens before them, fraught with great possibilities of noble achievement. It is worth a lifetime to behold the victory. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Poulson. That was very good. Since we have a smaller group, I can unmute everyone and we can just do the questions that way. But I want to start it off selfishly before I do that. I have a question.
Okay.
You had mentioned earlier the divide between Lucy Stone and Susan B. Anthony over, whether they should pursue women's suffrage or allow African-American men to get theirs first. And you had mentioned that Lucy Stone had a group of supporters. And that's pretty interesting because we don't really hear too much about that, these days in the conventional telling of the suffrage story. Was it a sizable group? Was it, close to a majority? Was it a minority? Like what was their background basically, I guess?
That's a good question. Initially, they were a larger group than Katie Stanton and Anthony. Katie Stanton and Anthony were just too radical. I mean, I didn't go into everything they did, but their attacks on religion and their outspokenness and some of the outrageous things they did were just too much for even some progressive-minded women. So the American Women's Suffrage Association was a kind of a safe place for women's suffrage, ordinary women's suffrage women to go and support. They also tried to go state by state. And one of the distinctive features is that Anthony and Katie Stanton wanted a federal amendment. And so one of the reasons, now let me say that Lucy Stone passes away in the 1890s, and before she does, her organization shrinks. And Katie Stanton and Anthony's organization, which now is the National American Women's Suffrage Association, grows. So one was growing in power and one was weakening. And I think over time, you could see that the sort of the new woman, more women were willing to participate in these, what was once a radical movement. Now it's more normal to be more militant or more aggressive in demanding a federal amendment.
Wonderful. That was very interesting to me. So I was
Yeah.
able to pick up on that. So okay, at this point, I'm going to unmute everyone. At least I'm going to try to anyway. And it says you are, hopefully. And if you have any questions, we can go from there. Oh, come on now, don't be shy.
Hi, Susan.
Hi, Mary Frances. It's wonderful to see you.
It's great to see you. It popped up on my Facebook feed and I thought, oh, I can't miss this. It's nice to see your face.
I think we should tell everybody that you and I are co-authors of some research on the history of women in higher education. So that's how we know each other.
Yeah, I saw some of that emerge in that presentation tonight.
Oh.
Our old friend, Dr. Clark.
Yeah.
Well, I was curious about sort of upstate New York as, you know, sort of this hotbed of both evangelical movement, the Mormon movement, sort of the burned over district and the Second Great Awakening, and how all that tied into women's suffrage and abolition. It just seemed like a lot of ferment was going on at this time, and upstate New York was really, you know, the center of it. And did any of that spill over into northeastern Pennsylvania?
That's a good question. Now, what Mary Frances has pointed out is upstate New York before the Civil War was kind of famous for being a tumultuous area, with an area that had a lot of new reform movements. The Mormons were established there during this time. It was very, the temperance movement was very big there. And this is, of course, where women's suffrage movement came out of. So it was fertile soil. And the answer is yes, there's a direct link that, you know, in fact, if you look at the men and women who signed the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments, they're mostly local people. They're from New York. And I think you could go to many other parts of the United States and they would not be so receptive. Other areas are support are Philadelphia because of the large Quaker population there. Quaker women are disproportionately involved in this effort. I mentioned that Lucretia Mott is a Quaker, but so is Alice Paul, who had gone to Swarthmore. And and actually Alice Paul is the first woman to get a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. She got a PhD in sociology, and she wrote her dissertation on the effort to how women can get the right to vote in Pennsylvania. The other area that was very supportive, fairly supportive, was Massachusetts. In fact, that's the home state for Lucy Stone and her husband, Henry Blackwell. Let me mention, one of the things that Lucy Stone was very well known for in the 1800s was she refused to give up her birth name. She was born Lucy Stone, and she would only marry her husband if she could keep her name. And so if a woman kept her name during that era, she was nicknamed a Lucy Stoner. So yes, the area definitely contributed. The Quaker background definitely contributed. And I'd say the general tumultuous kind of era of reform with abolition and temperance, et cetera, also contributed. So now, ironically, did it filter over into our area? From what I hear from our local historians of suffrage is that there was support for women's suffrage in the kind of the mining towns, and that the opposition to women's suffrage in Pennsylvania came from mostly other parts of the state. Now, what's interesting is that Pennsylvania, I believe, may have been the 8th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, which is good and early. But it was the first state to ratify that hadn't already given women the right to vote. Mm-hmm. So it's a mixed record for Pennsylvania. Certainly one of the leaders with the Quakers in Philadelphia and support here in our area. But as far as the entire state went, they were behind the ball on that.
If you look at the map of the 1915 referendum, it's very similar to a lot of maps we've been staring at all week. If you go county by county, the further west you went, the less support generally there was. Although Luzerne County and Lackawanna County did pass the referendum, but it did not pass statewide. So there's that.
Right. Yeah, I must say it is it's fun to live in this area because the politics are so noticeable. I mean, anybody who's been watching this presidential election and the last couple of presidential elections, just it's Scranton and our area is mentioned all the time. So
kind of a follow-up question to that too. With the New Woman and the suffrage movement in the 1890s, were they as willing to grant ethnic women or women with less education access to voting, or were they really, did they have an interest in having the right women vote?
Good question. It depended on the area of the United States. Now, Southern women were generally very opposed to having Black women have the right to vote. And in fact, in order to woo Southern women into this National American Women's Suffrage Association, the big organization agreed not to work for the suffrage of Black women. And so for a while, they basically accommodated that viewpoint. It's a mixed record with the parade under Alice Paul. Alice Paul personally did not endorse the segregation of women, but there were some state organizations that insisted that Black women march at the end of the parade, which is where many of them did. But on the other hand, there were many Black women who entered the parade in the middle of the parade. So it was kind of a mixed record. And I would say that of the women's suffrage movement as a whole, is that it really is a mixed record. There were women working for women's rights who openly espoused their fear that Black women might get the right to vote.
Well, if we have no other questions, I think that will do it for this evening. I want to thank Dr. Poulson. I want to thank you all for joining us this evening. This has been a great way, very fitting with everything that's going on in the week, to talk a little bit of politics, and especially on the centennial. 100 years, the more things change, as they say, the more they stay the same. And of course, as we all know, what is the historian's curse? May you live in interesting times. I would say we are certainly living in interesting times. But that would be all for us this evening. Thank you again all for coming, and have a good weekend.